Welcome everyone to Doc NYC on Crowdcast. I am Caitlin Boyle, the Director of Industry and Education at Doc NYC, and I hope you are all healthy and safe today. This is Doc NYC's third free webinar. Our past two installments discussed new strategies for distribution and cash flow for filmmakers. And you can find links to those recorded events by clicking on the green webinar resources button at the bottom of your screen. You can also follow us on Crowdcast by clicking the follow button next to the Doc NYC icon at the top right. You'll get automatic alerts for future events that way. Last week, we surveyed viewers and many of you about the topics you most wanted to learn about in this moment. And the top response by far was today's subject, film promotion and PR in stay-at-home times. This is a timely and evolving concern during the COVID-19 pandemic. And over the last few weeks, we've seen comments coming in from filmmakers, including this year's Oscar winner, Julia Reichardt in Ohio. She and her partner, Stephen Bognar, were honorees at last year's Doc NYC Visionaries Tribute for their film American Factory. And they now have a new film called 9 to 5, the story of a movement that was set to premiere at South by Southwest. Now it's awaiting a new chance to premiere. We know that many of you, many filmmakers watching today are experiencing similar disruptions. And of course, filmmakers count on festivals to find distribution. It's a long established system. You screen at a festival, you hope for good reviews in the trades, on social media, word of mouth, and you use the early traction found on the festival circuit to win the attention of distributors. Now there's economic pressure on all aspects of our industry, including the trade publications that are normally the first source of coverage for new films. Just this week, The Hollywood Reporter announced layoffs of its editorial staff, and that means fewer critics. So with these new obstacles, what can filmmakers do to get attention? And for films being released over the coming months, how can they create excitement? We know some films will delay their launches and others will forge ahead in this new distribution context, particularly if their stories intersect with timely events like the presidential election. So on today's webinar, we'll talk to three people who are among those on the front lines of spreading the word about independent documentaries. Each one has direct recent experiences relating to publicity in our new stay-at-home reality. Before we begin, a few user tips for the Crowdcast platform. First, please introduce yourself in the chat box on the right. Tell us where you're from, tell us about your projects. If you experience delays in your video or your audio, go to the help menu on the top right of your screen and switch to compatibility mode. That should help. If you've got a question during the session, add it to the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen, where you can also upvote others' questions so we can see where there are the most concerns or the most demand. And lastly, we all know video conferencing is fallible. If we run into technical issues, we will try to notify you in the comments section. Hang in there. Normally, we have been able to fix problems just within a few seconds or a few moments, and we thank you in advance for your patience if that should occur. The video will also be recorded, so afterward you can share this webinar at this link for later viewing. And if you have any playback issues with the recorded content, try using Chrome as your browser and make sure you're using the latest version. Before we bring in our guests, we also want to highlight some optimistic news from the festival world. Many of you know that CPH Docs in Copenhagen was one of the festivals affected early in the COVID-19 crisis. Their live festival was shut down just a couple weeks before it was set to open. And within 2 days, the team set up a platform to move the festival online and geo-block films inside Denmark and put limits on ticket sales, just like it was a real live festival. The results they have experienced are really inspiring. They wound up reaching more people than they had in 2019. And they held a virtual conversation with Edward Snowden that was originally going to take place in a 2,000-seat theater. And online, it has so far received more than 60,000 views. Other festivals have also made quick pivots to moving online. Right now, the Cleveland International Film Festival is taking place with virtual screenings that are geo-blocked within the state of Ohio. And so from our team at Doc NYC and all the festivals ahead, we'll be learning from these groundbreaking examples. And we are encouraged by the ingenuity and the innovation that our peers have shown in adjusting to these new challenges. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Doc NYC.
Hello, I am going to bring up Charlie Olsky. There we go. I'm going to say goodbye to you, Caitlin. Thank you. Hey, Charlie. Thank you very much for being here. So Charlie Olsky is a publicist at Cinetic Marketing. He's got many years of experience on documentary films. Some of the titles he's worked on include The Cave, that was Oscar nominated this past year, and Free Solo, that won the Oscar last year. In the past month, his slate of films includes 2 documentaries that were selected for the Tribeca Film Festival and 2 documentaries being released by Netflix. So thank you very much again for being here, Charlie.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start with a film that you've been working on that was selected for the opening night of the Tribeca Film Festival. It's called Jimmy Carter, Rock and Roll President, directed by Mary Wharton. So explain to me, what the course of this film was, and once Tribeca had to shift to an online experience.
Sure. The film is it's the story of Jimmy Carter and how he basically came to office, told through music, told through the idea that musicians really helped get attention to him, and then he, in the meantime, had a great relationship with them. And it was chosen for the opening night film for Tribeca, so it was going to be, this big gala that was going to be at the Beacon. There was a performance scheduled afterwards by Willie Nelson, Nile Rodgers, and others. And that was something that was announced in February. They played a clip on NBC, and it was set up to be just a really nice event. And so when Tribeca went digital, it was a digital festival that was just to industry and press, but not to public. So it's not one of the ones like CPH Docs where it's geo-tagged and people will be going to see it. So that's the story of the Jimmy Carter Rock and Roll President.
And so this film is not going to participate in the online facing industry and press version of Tribeca, if I understand correctly, right?
That is correct. We have done some interviews with the filmmakers. They've done some stories, but there was such an amazing sort of event component of this, that this was going to be with this live show, that it really is sort of this musical experience. And we'd already had a fair amount of press attention based on it being the opening night film. That our discussions, we decided we were going to try to, save that event and hopefully do something that would be a premiere. And not risk sacrificing any sort of premiere status later. Part of the thing that we're experiencing right now is nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody knows how other festivals are going to take. If a festival in September, for instance, Toronto, would consider.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, you've heard of it. Would consider this a premiere if it premiered on the press industry site, or if they would be thus able to do the premiere. And then part of that is also nobody knows where we'll be in September too.
Right.
So there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's decisions made that aren't. We hope we're doing the right thing. Yeah.
So then you had another film at Tribeca called Wake Up on Mars. This one is appearing in the documentary competition. And this film took a different strategy for Tribeca. They stayed in the online industry facing portion, allowing themselves to stay in competition, vie for the jury awards that are still going to take place. And I think that there's probably a lot of filmmakers who are watching right now who are in a similar place. Maybe they had a film that was at South by Southwest or Tribeca or Hot Docs or Full Frame or any number of spring festivals. And they are wondering, what can they do or should they do to try to get some press right now? Later on, we'll talk to Eric Kohn and we'll talk about how Indywire has been reviewing some of these films. So talk about your strategy in trying to get some attention for this film while it's on the online platform of Tribeca.
Sure. As you stated, this is in competition at Tribeca, and I think it's a really valuable tool to be working with, to be able to be competitive in a category. And we wouldn't want to necessarily sacrifice that for any movie that's up for potential awards that, and especially something like this, like I mentioned with the Jimmy Carter movie, we've gotten a fair amount of press about it already. And there was some more awareness, but this was really something that I think was going to be helped so much by being in Tribeca and having that behind it. So what we've done is we've still been in discussion with a lot of different critics. So we've been, we just had our Hollywood Reporter review run. We've had, been in touch with all of the various different trades about running it to try to get, just some critical momentum to hopefully lead to some sales, to lead into distribution talk. With the idea being that most press right now that we're going to be focusing on is going to be trade press, is going to be focused on the industry, about getting the industry to pay attention to something. We can worry about public audiences later because public audiences cannot see it at the moment. So this is really about drumming up interest amongst the industry to take the movie on, to release it to audiences later.
Let me ask you about your experience in doing that. Caitlin mentioned it in her introduction that, like everyone, film journalists are also, under pressure during COVID-19. They have less time on their hands, like all of us do, and it's hard to focus. I've just put up on the screen here an article you got placed in Indywire for the trailer for Wake Up on Mars. Can you talk about what your experiences have been as you're reaching out to trade publications, trying to get the reviews and coverage that you would normally trying to be getting if Tribeca was happening as a live event? Yeah.
I think the thing is, a lot of trade publications, everybody's in the same boat right now of that uncertainty. The uncertainty is just everywhere. And so understanding that trade publications, there's not many movies coming out right now. So I think they need the content as well. I think it's important to sort of be staying in contact with journalists as this goes on. So you're not just cold pitching out of nowhere saying like, acting as if everything is normal when it isn't. So it's good to continue sort of relationships that you've had instead of just trying to restart everything from scratch. But yeah, I mean, trades and all of the various different press outlets are trying to figure out how to do this as well as anybody else is. So I think it comes out of a lot of discussions. I hope that answers.
Well, that's a good start. None of us have all the answers. Let me ask you about a couple films that you've been working on in release. We can start with Crip Camp. So this is a film that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. I had a chance to show it at the Miami Film Festival, and before that festival got shut down midway through. It won an audience prize at Sundance. We were supposed to be showing it at our Pure Nonfiction series at IFC Center on March 24th, but that season, of course, got canceled when theaters were closed. And it came on to Netflix on March 25th. So it was only a couple weeks into people adjusting to this quarantine. What was it like trying to get press for this film, and what kind of lessons can we learn from people who are going to be releasing films in the coming weeks and months and trying to get press?
Sure. What I can say about Crip Camp is it's a film that had tremendous momentum coming out of Sundance, coming out of the winter festivals. It's produced by Higher Ground, Barack and Michelle Obama's Netflix company. So it had tremendous momentum. And then for me, just from trying to pitch it, there was maybe 1 week solid of just all bets are off. Nobody knows what's happening. We're just responding to this thing. And it started a cycle of what I think is the new normal for the time being, which is that everything comes together very last minute. So we've been in discussion, for instance, with the New York Times about doing a feature related to the movie. And that just went cold. Usually we would have that kind of a feature set up maybe 3-4 weeks in advance. And less than a week out, we talked to them and they decided to do something about one of the subjects, Judy Human. And so it was great that came together. And a lot of other things came together really at the last moment. And it's what I'm finding now too, sort of moving on, was that basically things are just holding for a little bit longer. There's not as much impetus for anybody to move, I think, with huge advance notice, because people just don't know where we're going to be in 3 weeks, in 4 weeks. So instead, it's sort of that things are coming together closer to the time of. That said, I feel like when the movie actually came out, we were thrilled about the press that we had. It was there might have been a few pieces that were delayed till later, I think, because some outlets just aren't doing the same kind of arts coverage that they were in a pre-COVID world. But at the same time, when we're looking at things that are being released, it's a much less competitive landscape out there, because really it's just the streamers.
Right. There's no James Bond movie.
There's no James Bond movie. Yeah.
So before I let you go, let me ask you about one other film that you've got coming out next week. This is another one, Circus of Books. We were going to be supposed to show it at our Pure Nonfiction at IFC Center series on March 17th. It was the first one of ours to get canceled by Rachel Mason. So this is a film that premiered at Tribeca last year, where it caught the attention of Netflix, and they're going to be releasing it next week, if I'm not mistaken, next Wednesday, I think it comes out. So can you talk about, what have been your experiences trying to get attention for Circus of Books?
So this is something, this is a campaign that I've been working on more actively after the COVID separation sort of started. And it holds up to all of this, sort of the idea that everything's happening much more last minute, that things are coming together much quicker. But it's been a very good experience for us. For one, because people really enjoy the movie, but it might be something that was, it seemed more as a niche film. It's it's about a woman made the movie about her own parents who owned a gay adult bookstore in Los Angeles, and then became sort of these very nice entrepreneurs of gay porn. And she wasn't aware of what they were doing until she was a teenager. And so she made the movie about her family. It's a great family story. It's, very surprising and touching and funny. But it's it's a movie that I think has gotten that much more of a kick because it's, I think because of the family dynamic, and because it's just it's a good distraction movie.
Okay. So, Charlie, I'm about to let you, I'm going to bring in our next guest, Eric Kohn, but while I'm bringing Eric to screen, let me ask you, as your team at Cinetic Marketing, you work on a big slate of titles, and as you're looking ahead to the spring, how are you starting, now that we've been in this for a month or so, how are you starting to adjust?
How are we starting to adjust? We try to look at other things. I don't know. We try to figure out what to do with the new normal, because of the uncertainty, because we don't know what's coming. We just try to figure out and help sort of set up with, working with press, working with distributors, working with filmmakers, to say, to come up with new solutions. So what does it mean to be premiering at an online festival? What does it mean to say, I'm waiting till 2021?
Right.
Why would your film do that? Why would your, so I think it's coming up with solutions for that, and really working with each individual film is a different story. That's one thing. And then, I don't know. Keeping our fingers crossed other than that.
Well, thank you, Charlie. We'll all be watching out for Wake Up on Mars. I hope people do tune in to Circus of Books next week, and appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, now I'm going to bring in Eric Kohn. Eric is going to bring himself in. Welcome, Eric. Eric is the executive editor and chief critic at Indywire. You guys made a decision right away when South by Southwest canceled. You made this commitment that you were going to be reviewing and giving coverage to South by Southwest, and you've been keeping that up through Tribeca. And so, can you talk to us about that decision, and also kind of what it's meant for your team?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and thanks for having Charlie before me, because it was nice to hear that perspective. One of the things I think is really valuable about having both PR and media in this conversation is that it really does involve a collaboration of both sides of that equation. And I think a lot of times that's lost in the conversation about how we do our work. So when it came to the situation with South by Southwest, really the first film festival to feel the most immediate effects of what we're all going through now, it had to involve a certain kind of negotiation with the industry. I mean, as both a critic and an editor and a reporter, I was well aware that we couldn't just rush into this and start writing about these movies if the movies weren't looking for coverage, because this festival wasn't happening. So there was an immediate disruption to an existing ecosystem that we all sort of work together to sustain. The press covers something, the programmers choose it, publicists work on these films, and sales agents in a lot of cases are choosing to bring them to that environment to sell them. So with the festival canceled, we had to understand what these other stakeholders wanted to get out of the equation. So what was fascinating for me was talking to critics at other trade publications to see what they were thinking through, and then going to the festival itself and seeing where they were at in terms of possibly proceeding with making some aspect of the festival exist in a virtual space, and then to talk to other festivals as well, because if we were covering these films, we didn't want to create further problems for them down the line, where, for example, a film that had its world premiere canceled would somehow no longer qualify to be a world premiere somewhere else if festivals were to come back in a couple months. And we got enough of a sense of confidence that there were films that we could cover in this context without creating that kind of a ripple effect, and films that would make themselves available to us that we also, from a curatorial standpoint, thought would be worth covering. So we weren't able to cover the big studio events. There were no keynotes, but we made the determination that there were a dozen or so films that were worthwhile and worth talking about. So it was fascinating from that standpoint to be able to go through the process necessary to make that decision. And at this point, it's a case-by-case kind of a situation. We have to look at this as, the familiar rule book is out the window, so we have to improvise. And there are films I realize that are smaller films looking to make sales, and without some kind of coverage, they don't really exist in the world in the same kind of way. So we are open to covering some measure of films in that respect, but we also have limited bandwidth, and we need to make some very specific decisions about how we commit to certain films and then pass on others.
Can you talk about that bandwidth issue? Because, from the outside, first of all, I have to commend Indywire, because I think we all take it for granted as such a reliable service. And, there's some organizations where you can see them slowing down during COVID-19, but from my standpoint, you guys haven't missed a beat. But can you share with us from inside your team, are there extra pressures that's in doing coverage these days?
Well, I think we're busier than ever before because we are a news organization, and the news cycle has intensified. It's intensified on every level of society and culture. And in our little space, it's been fascinating to figure out all the different ways in which this has complicated what we've done. So I think the pressure, if anything, is to innovate and figure out new ways of covering what we're doing and doubling down and staying on top of the most important films and conversations around film that are taking place right now. We're also, looking to think outside the box in terms of how we cover everything. I mean, our ability to do, live interviews and things like that we wouldn't have done in the past has intensified because we don't have any other option. One of the conversations we had right around the time South by was canceled was not only is this are we missing this festival on the calendar, but we are now looking at a situation where everything that we sort of take for granted as something that gives us content is no longer there. So if we can't send somebody to an event, how do we create an event in-house? I mean, what you're doing here is an interesting case study on some level. It's if you can create a virtual panel, then on some level you are filling a gap that would otherwise be missing right now. And so we're trying to do something similar with some of the video interviews that we're doing on social media and so forth. And then in terms of how we're covering new releases, it's been very interesting because, films that I think there's a stigma associated with the VOD space that's come out of the last few years in which, generally speaking, films that skip theatrical entirely were often considered to be, unless it was, one of the big streaming platforms, something that might not be worth our time. And we're trying to pay attention to that space more carefully now, while at the same time not losing touch with the appropriate standards for what merits coverage on the site. So we're also exploring the TV space to fill that gap to some degree, a little bit more than we would have in the past, while being attuned to the festivals to kind of give us some indication of the films that are worth our time.
So Eric, we've seen a lot of questions coming in from filmmakers who had films, they lost their premieres at festivals. Some of these are smaller films than a couple of the ones I talked about with Charlie. I know that I'm going to call up this screen here. It's something you do often at festivals, including Doc NYC. It's taking a minute to come up, but it's your top list for Tribeca. And, I could pull back the curtain a little bit. I know, prior to Doc NYC, you usually reach out to me a few weeks in advance and ask for some recommendations of things that you might otherwise miss. And, when I make those recommendations, I'm usually skimming over the films that I think you'd obviously get, like, a film by a major director, and trying to, show you some of the gems. And I know that you have those conversations with other people too. I mean, for the sake of filmmakers, there are probably hundreds of just documentary filmmakers who have lost premieres and who are craving the kind of coverage that you can give. Can you talk about some of the ecosystem that you described before, about who you're getting your information from?
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, certain rules haven't changed. I mean, having a program that somebody else curated to respond to gives us some kind of existing infrastructure to plan our coverage and say, this is something worth your time. If we were simply just waiting for filmmakers to come to us and say, hey, I have this new movie, can you review it? We would be spending much more time kind of scanning through a wide array of options than we would be able to respond to, and nobody would win as a result of that. So we do still rely on a certain kind of infrastructure to our industry to tell us what's worth our time. And usually that would be, a starting point would be festivals. And so whether it's you or other programmers, usually I do make the effort to kind of get a little information on background so that I can understand a little bit more about what's worth our time. Now, I also, I have a tendency to push people to be as honest as possible with me, because I'm talking to so many different people that I can kind of develop my own understanding of what's really worthwhile, because everybody who makes their own movie feels like they have something to offer and they want to get it reviewed. But at the end of the day, we also realize that there are films that have very few resources that aren't necessarily going to benefit from just getting slammed in Indywire, and we don't want to waste time with something that we think is not necessarily going to resonate in the context of a review. So I would say it's important to be realistic about what you're actually looking to get. If you're looking to get a review because you need to get a sale or something like that, I would rely on the instincts of a sales agent or a publicist as much as possible. But I would also say, if the film doesn't have appropriate context to be reviewed, there isn't really a reason to be pushing to have it reviewed. If it's not getting some kind of virtual showcase or getting distributed, I'm not sure why trying to get a critic to tell the world about it is going to do much of anything in that context. But I also think that it's worth thinking about, what else do you have to offer? I mean, look, I'm not just a critic. I am an editor and run our film coverage. And one of the things that I think a lot of people don't always realize is sometimes, let's say with a documentary especially, the most compelling thing about it is not if it's a really great film that's going to get rave reviews. It's how it was made, or the story that it's telling, or the subject, or something to that effect. And if there's a good news hook, if there's a good story associated with the film itself, that may be something worth leaning into. So even if you don't necessarily have a festival context, if you have a good story to tell as a filmmaker, from a journalistic standpoint, that's something I want to hear about too. So that's something I think a lot of times people don't always realize when they're so obsessed with the currency of the review and nothing else, is that there's more to tell than just that.
Eric, yesterday you did an Instagram talk with Barry Jenkins. You've been doing more of this kind of stuff at Indywire. And I think for us at festivals and for filmmakers too, as we respond to everyone being at home, we have to kind of change our thinking to how do we use these digital tools to create excitement online. This is our third webinar. Every time we learn a little bit more about how to do it. I wonder, what are some of the things that you've learned from the online interviews and things that you've been doing?
I think that it's been a great moment for us to think outside the box. I mean, the silver lining in this is that it's forcing us to try things we wouldn't necessarily have leaned into. Instagram Live is a great example. There are certain kinds of personalities and conversations that make sense in that format and others that don't. And it's totally democratized too. So if you have a sturdy social following, you can go on Instagram Live yourself and just be the media. But what we've found is that it's a really interesting way to take more of a casual approach to talking to people who are in our wheelhouse. It's less valuable if you have something to promote, I think, because it's the format is it's harder to control the quality, and it feels to some degree at odds with the kind of the formality of promoting your work that I think is necessary for putting something out into the world. And there's a time limit on it. You can't go longer than an hour usually. So it's a very specific kind of approach. But we've been doing other things in Zoom where you can have better production values and blast it out across various different platforms that I think have allowed us to be a little bit more creative in terms of what we can do. And so I would say, to the publicists out there who are trying to figure out how to position the films that they're working on, that anything you can do that feels different, that can catch people's attention and takes advantage of these digital tools is welcome right now. And we did this really fun thing for the film Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, where the star, this teenage actress who was also a singer, and she did a performance for us. So now we're looking into, can we do more live musical events on the site? And not only does that bring us more eyeballs, but I think that it helps us contextualize something that we would otherwise not necessarily be able to capture on the site in quite the same sort of way. So if people are open to that kind of innovation, it's very attractive to us.
That's great. So I'm going to ask you one more question. I'm going to simultaneously be bringing in our next guest, George Nicholis from Magnolia. So, there was this terrible news this week about the Hollywood Reporter laying off editorial staff, including the great critic Todd McCarthy. All these publications must be under pressure, including yours. And, I wonder if you have some reflections on, the state of the industry for trade publications.
Well, first, my heart goes out to everybody at Hollywood Reporter. Some really talented people lost their jobs this past week, and Todd McCarthy, who I know quite well, is an institution, and I'm sure he will figure out some way forward. I think the bigger challenge is for people who are freelance and trying to get by as journalists covering this industry and dependent on publications that might not have the resources to support them. Now, I can only speak from my own experience from a business standpoint that we're fine because we don't have a print component. We don't have a lot of signature events that are attached to sponsorship right now, and so we're actually in a really interesting time because from a business standpoint, I think we're humming along and doing pretty well. But in terms of how trades are dealing with all this, I think we're going to see it's still a process of evolution, and we're going to see some unstable period of time ahead where it's not really clear what the traditional trade rules are, and that involves coverage of festivals, coverage of the industry, coverage of box office. Obviously, all the things that we've sort of taken for granted about what trade publications do are in flux. Now, from a revenue standpoint, I think it's more just a question of, well, how are our companies going to step up and figure out ways of supporting these publications with the kind of marketing budgets that they have. But look, Emmy season and Oscar season aren't dead yet. So as long as we have those, I think that we can kind of collaborate to make sure that there is a sustainable model going forward.
Well, Eric, I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule. I encourage people to listen for the podcasts that Eric does weekly with Ann Thompson, the Indywire. What's the name of your podcast?
Screen Talk.
Indywire Screen Talk. Thank you again for everything that you do, Eric.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. This is great.
Okay, I'm going to say goodbye to Eric, and I'm going to bring up George Nicholis from Magnolia. Welcome, George. George is the head of publicity at Magnolia Pictures. That's the theatrical distributor known for films like I'm Not Your Negro and RBG. The Magnolia is behind the film Once for Brothers, Robbie Robertson and the Band, that was Doc NYC's opening night film last November. And the film had just gone into theatrical release a few weeks before theaters had to close down. There's another recent Magnolia title, Slay the Dragon, that was scheduled for theatrical release on March 13th and then got pushed back to a digital-only release on April 3rd. And Slay the Dragon is a good example of a film that can't afford to wait. It's an election year film about gerrymandering. I've seen some other comments in our section and questions about people who have films that can't afford to wait. So I think Slay the Dragon is a good example there. George, welcome. Thank you for being here. Oh, George, can you hear me, George? George, I can't. I don't know if you can hear me or if you're having trouble hearing me. Me. Can you hear me, George? Are you there? Here, you know what? I'm gonna
technical difficulties.
Yeah, I'm gonna reach George on my.
Hello.
Hey, George. I can.
Hey, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, and we're hearing you through here. So
okay,
we'll do it this way.
I'll do my best.
Yes. Let's talk about Once for Brothers, George. This was in theaters, and then you pivoted to be a digital release. Can you talk about how you did that, and and what the experience has been?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was strange. The film opened February 21st, so it had been in theaters for a few weeks. Pretty soon into its pretty early into its theatrical life, when sort of the world got upturned. So it had been doing well, but we had to quickly sort of pivot to a digital strategy for the film. And luckily, we're one of the main pioneers of the day and date model a long time ago. And so we were able to kind of talk to all of our partners in the VOD and digital space to quickly get the film. Its VOD digital date moved up to April 3rd. So while we were sort of talking to them and having those kind of discussions, we were also looking for ways we could, support those independent, smaller theaters that had been playing the film and that had just been playing our films for like the last 20 years. So, we saw others had been doing it, and so we did it too. We created a virtual cinema program where we were able to offer films like Once We're Brothers and even Slay the Dragon a week before its VOD and digital launch. And we split the proceeds and they went back to supporting those theaters. So it was a lot of phone calls, a lot of work, but it's the response has been really great so far.
So I think the interesting thing about this model, where just to recap, so you've created this digital site here where you've partnered with a number of these theaters, and when someone clicks and buys a ticket through this theater, some money is going to go to Magnolia and some money is going to go to the theater. Exactly.
Yep. The week before the film actually hit VOD digital, it was 100% of the proceeds went to those theaters, and it's more of an even split. Yep.
So let me talk about the next film I mentioned, Slay the Dragon. You did a release on April 3rd, a digital release, after you had to cancel a theatrical release. You're doing the same thing, making it available to theaters for a split. But talk about, since this is a webinar about promotion and PR, talk about some of the strategies that you took to get the word out about Slay the Dragon. I mean, it's a tougher film to market than a film about Robbie Robertson. It's about gerrymandering. So what were some of the things that worked for you?
The film initially was intended to be a March 13th purely theatrical release. And, as we sort of kind of got closer and closer to that date and things started happening in the world, we saw that wasn't really probably going to be a reality. So we quickly, also pivoted to move the date up to April 3rd in theaters and on demand. And as we got closer to that, obviously, theaters shuttered and it became just sort of like a purely VOD and digital release. But for a film like that, it is, it is hard to sort of get attention for, because it is such a sort of very specific political issue, which affects everybody. Everybody might not know exactly what gerrymandering is, but we sort of have to rely on people's relationships with, politicians who are sort of aligned with redistricting efforts and kind of like raising awareness for it. So, people like, former Attorney General Eric Holder or Governor Schwarzenegger in California, Michael Moore, really kind of getting those sort of larger than life figures that people know and getting their support. So, Eric Holder wrote this really great op-ed that we were able to place in the Hollywood Reporter last month. So, that helped. Michael Moore, who actually participated in the virtual cinema program with Slay the Dragon for his film festival in Michigan, he screened the film for his audience and was able to do a Facebook Live with Katie Fahey, who's the main subject of the film. So we were really kind of looking at things like that, and just really engaging them, trying to get them to support it on social media. Hillary Clinton watched the film and tweeted about it right before the film came out. So it's you really have to sort of rely on things like that, And I know people had relationships with MSNBC, CNN, a lot of those journalists who covered that. And early on, maybe like 3 weeks before we came out, we had bookings on MSNBC, and we did those things. And it's good that we did and didn't wait until closer to the April 3rd release, because, on a good day, you hope to not get bumped, for breaking news. But, after, as you got closer to April and things got really, really serious, there's like no shot at getting anybody to talk about this issue if it's not COVID-19 related,
I see a question came up in the comments from filmmaker Joseph Lovett, who was asking about, if I understand correctly, the deal that you're doing with the theater and the split with theaters. He was asking about the filmmakers' cut of that. I mean, without going into the details of your contracts with filmmakers, but am I correct in thinking that whatever a filmmaker's share would have normally been of ticket sales, that hasn't changed in this situation?
Yeah, it's a lot to get into, and it's different, situation by situation. But yeah, it's really kind of, yeah.
Proprietary,
really
but it's not it's not different than it's not substantially different than it would be if it was a normal distribution deal.
Right.
All right. I want to I want to ask you about how COVID-19 has changed your slate of spring films. You've got a lot of great films that were originally scheduled from the spring. Collective, which I showed at the Toronto Film Festival last year, and people think is, a chief awards contender this year. The Fight, which Kerry Washington is a executive producer on, from the team that made Wiener, and John Lewis' Good Trouble, about the great congressperson John Lewis, directed by Dawn Porter. These were all films that you were kind of coming out in the May-June corridor, and now your plans have changed. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly, it's an understatement to say that things have changed, not just for us, but for everybody, the entire industry, But like everybody else, we're monitoring the situation day by day to see what happens. When theaters are going to reopen. Magnolia's always will be supportive of the theatrical experience. So I think we're just kind of playing a little bit of a wait and see. But unlike everybody, luckily we're nimble, and kind of going back to us, pioneering the day and date model. We're able to change dates and release strategies relatively quickly, which I think sets us apart a little bit. So fortunate enough, we've been just kind of taking a look at everything and which films we can safely push back in the hopes that theaters will reopen, and which ones that might not be, possible for. But yeah, we're really just kind of taking it day by day and seeing what the landscape looks like.
I mean, none of us have a crystal ball. We've got a question from Julia Reichert, the Oscar-winning filmmaker of American Factory, with her partner, Stephen Bognar. And they, as mentioned at the top of this podcast, had a film that was going to be at South by Southwest called 9 to 5. And, now they're wondering about when to release this film. They're wondering about the fall. None of us have a crystal ball. But I'm curious in your team, how do you think about the fall? Do you worry about a backlog of films coming out? Do you have any general thoughts?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that, there's sort of two camps. There are films that you can release sort of now while all this is going on, if there is some kind of a VOD and digital day and date component. So you can kind of get the films out now and worrying about if it's a documentary that you hope to qualifying that later when things sort of reopen. But there are those films that, would definitely needs to be seen in theaters and really be a theatrical experience. So I think that a lot of people are kind of just waiting to see what happens. But I mean, if theaters don't open until like September, there's going to be a really short window, and there is a chance for things to get really backlogged, So it's right. There is no crystal ball, but I think all you can really do is just kind of talk to your peers and talk to other people in the industry and just kind of, see what happens. And hopefully you can make a quick pivot where you're not going to just be on top of 5 other films.
My last question for you, George, before I let you go. You work on the publicity side, but I wonder for your colleagues who work on acquisitions, who are looking at films at South by Southwest or Tribeca, or normally would be looking at those films? Do you have a sense of how they're approaching their business, if it's changed, or do they still have the same appetite to be acquiring the films that they normally would?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, nothing's changed, you know? I mean, I think that as always, it just really depends. You know, we're always looking for great films. This isn't going to last forever. You know, we have to keep releasing movies. So I think that, you know, we're just looking for great films that are out there, and then, you know, worry about the distribution strategy of those down the road. So yeah, we're just watching things, and nothing's really changed on that front.
All right, George, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Of course, thanks for having me. Okay,
going to let you go. Before we wind this up, I want to talk about a couple tidbits of news. This was late breaking just today, and you know, very pleasing to see that the Sundance Institute announced an artist relief fund. This follows similar funds started by American Documentary that we highlighted last week, and another from Field of Vision and Topic. We know from those funds that the demand was very intense. So they were overwhelmed with submissions, and I think had to cut off applications after a week. So if you do intend to apply for Sundance, you should do so immediately, and you can read up on details on Indywire. Then a very sad piece of news this week that I wanted to acknowledge. I want to pay tribute to a real friend of documentary film who passed away. Holtzman was a longtime producer for the Los Angeles public radio station KCRW. He created the podcast The Document that covered nonfiction films like Circus of Books and Hail Satan. There's a great episode on Emile D'Antonio's classic Underground. I'd actually never met Matt in person, but we bonded by email and phone over our love of documentary, and his enthusiasm was palpable. He died of cancer at age 56. And for those of us who admired his work, that loss is deeply felt. I hope you will find some time in the coming days to listen to his work on The Document. I want to give a big thanks to IFC Films Unlimited, who's been sponsoring these webinars. The subscription site is home to many great documentaries, dramas, and comedies. It's available in the US and Canada. You can get the app on Apple TV or subscribe on Amazon Prime. You'll find documentaries like How to Survive a Plague, Touching the Void, Thin Blue Line. So thanks again to IFC Films Unlimited for their support. And before we let you go, wherever you are in the world, you can access these free resources at docnyc.net. You can sign up for our Monday Memo newsletter that delivers you the week's documentary news at purenonfiction.net. You can hear podcast interviews that I do with documentary filmmakers. There are recent episodes on One Child Nation, For Sama, American Factory. You can listen on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Lastly, DocNYC's marketing team at Together Films will hold their 5th weekly webinar next Monday. They've been sharing invaluable advice for how to do virtual screenings and engage audiences online. You can watch the previous 4 installments for free on Crowdcast. This webinar here has been recorded and will stay available for free on Crowdcast. It'll probably take a couple minutes after we close out, and then it'll be up and ready. We will be announcing new online content soon, so stay tuned to our Facebook and Twitter feeds at DocNYC Fest. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we have captured them, and that will definitely feed into what we're doing in the future. If I see things after this and feel I have good answers, I will keep updating the comments section here with anything that I can share. I want to thank our production coordinator, Sarah Modo, our industry and education director, Caitlin Boyle, and executive director, Raphael Nehausen. On behalf of the DocNYC team, we wish you a great weekend.